For 30 years, I believed I was living a blessed life as the secret wife of our beloved pastor David Richardson. I bore him 4 beautiful children, kept his house, and served his ministry with unwavering devotion. But when his legal wife died, and I went to claim my rightful place beside him, I discovered the most devastating truth of my life. In every official document, every church record, every legal paper, I wasn't listed as his wife. I was listed as his sister. The man I loved, trusted, and gave my entire life to had stolen my identity, my dignity, and 30 years of my existence. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of religious abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Margaret Sullivan, but everyone called me Maggie. I'm 72 years old now, and I've spent the better part of my adult life believing in a lie so profound, so carefully constructed, that even now, 2 years after discovering the truth, I sometimes wake up wondering if it was all just a terrible nightmare. It started in 1992. I was 42 years old, recently divorced, and struggling to raise my teenage son Tommy from my first marriage. I'd moved to the small town of Cedar Falls, hoping for a fresh start. A place where the whispers about my failed marriage wouldn't follow me. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the church was the heart of the community, and where a woman like me, divorced, working 2 jobs, trying to keep her head above water, was viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Cornerstone Baptist Church sat right in the center of Main Street, its white steeple reaching toward heaven like a beacon of hope. I'll never forget the first Sunday I walked through those heavy wooden doors. The congregation was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 60 people scattered across pews that could hold twice that number. But what struck me immediately was the warmth. People smiled, they welcomed me, they made me feel like I belonged somewhere for the first time in years. And then there was Pastor David Richardson. He was 50 at the time, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kindest blue eyes I'd ever seen. When he spoke from that pulpit, it was like he was speaking directly to my soul. His voice was gentle but commanding, his words carefully chosen, his presence absolutely magnetic. He had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room, like God himself was speaking through this humble servant. After that first service, Pastor David sought me out personally. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, taking my hand in both of his, "I want you to know how blessed we are to have you join our church family. I can see that you're a woman of great faith." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm not sure about that, Pastor. I'm going through some difficult times." His grip on my hand tightened slightly, and his eyes seemed to peer right into my heart. "Those difficult times are exactly why God brought you here, Maggie. May I call you Maggie?" When I nodded, he smiled that warm, paternal smile that would become so familiar to me. "God doesn't make mistakes. He's placed you in our path for a reason." Over the next few months, Pastor David became more than just my spiritual leader. He became my confidant, my counselor, my anchor in a storm that seemed to have no end. When I struggled with Tommy's teenage rebellion, Pastor David was there with wise counsel. When I couldn't make ends meet, the church mysteriously found ways to help. A bag of groceries left on my doorstep, an anonymous envelope with just enough cash to cover my electric bill, opportunities for extra work cleaning the church or helping with administrative tasks. "The Lord provides," Pastor David would say whenever I tried to thank him. "He works through his people to care for his children." I threw myself into church life with the devotion of someone who'd been drowning and finally found solid ground. I joined the choir, taught Sunday school, organized church suppers, and volunteered for every ministry that would have me. Cornerstone Baptist became more than my church, it became my entire world. Pastor David's attention to me was constant and caring, but always appropriate, always within the bounds of what a pastor should be to a member of his congregation. His wife, Linda, was a quiet woman who seemed to prefer staying in the background. She was polite to me but distant, which I attributed to shyness. She rarely attended church functions beyond Sunday morning service, and Pastor David often mentioned how her poor health kept her at home. "Linda has always been frail," he told me one evening when I was helping him organize files in his church office. "She's a good woman, devoted to God, but she's never had the strength for ministry work. Sometimes I wonder if God meant for me to carry this burden alone." The way he said it, with such sadness and resignation, broke my heart. Here was this wonderful man doing God's work, caring for an entire community, and he seemed so lonely despite being surrounded by people who loved and respected him. As the months turned into a year, our relationship deepened. Pastor David began asking for my opinion on sermons, including me in decisions about church activities, treating me less like a congregation member and more like a partner in ministry. Other church members began to notice. "Maggie, you and Pastor David work so well together," said Mrs. Henderson, one of the church elders' wives. "It's like you can read each other's minds." I blushed at the comment, but secretly, I was thrilled. Working alongside Pastor David felt natural, like we were meant to be a team. When he praised my dedication, when he told me how much the church needed someone like me, when he said that God had truly blessed them by bringing me into their lives, I felt a purpose I'd never experienced before. It was in late 1993, almost 2 years after I'd joined the church, that everything changed. I was staying late one evening, helping Pastor David prepare for the annual church revival. We'd been working for hours, and I was tired, emotional from some family stress with Tommy, who was getting into trouble at school. "Maggie," Pastor David said softly, looking up from the papers spread across his desk. "Come sit with me for a moment." I took the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd sat for countless counseling sessions, prayer meetings, and planning discussions. "I need to share something with you," he said, his voice taking on the serious tone he used when delivering important spiritual guidance. "I've been praying about this for months, seeking God's will, and I believe He's given me an answer." My heart began to race. Something in his tone, in the way he was looking at me, suggested this was going to be significant. "God has shown me that you and I are meant to be together, Maggie. Not just as partners in ministry, but as husband and wife in His eyes." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat there speechless, trying to process what he just said. "I know this is shocking," he continued, reaching across the desk to take my hand. "And I know the complexity of the situation. But God's ways are not always conventional. He's called us to something greater than what the world would understand. But you're married," I managed to whisper. Pastor David's expression grew pained, and he squeezed my hand tighter. "Linda and I, our marriage has been over in all but name for years. She knows this, we've discussed it, and she understands that God has a different plan for both of us. She'll continue to be my wife in the eyes of the church and the community. It would cause too much scandal and hurt the ministry if we divorced publicly. But in God's eyes, in the spiritual realm where true marriage exists, you are meant to be my wife." I felt like the room was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about right and wrong, about marriage and commitment, was being turned upside down. "I don't understand," I said, tears starting to flow. Pastor David came around the desk and knelt beside my chair, taking both my hands in his. "Maggie, look at me. Look into my eyes and tell me you don't feel what I feel. Tell me you haven't sensed that God has been drawing us together for a purpose greater than either of us could accomplish alone." I looked into those kind blue eyes that had guided me through the darkest period of my life, eyes that belonged to the man who had shown me what it meant to truly serve God. And yes, I had felt something. I had felt a connection, a sense of rightness when we worked together, a feeling that this was where I belonged. "But how can this be right?" I asked through my tears. "Because God is bigger than human institutions," he said with the authority that had drawn me to him from the very beginning. "Because sometimes He calls His servants to walk a path that others won't understand. Abraham was called to sacrifice his son. Moses was called to lead people who didn't want to follow him. David was called to serve God despite his human failings. And we, Maggie, are called to love each other and serve Him together, regardless of what others might think." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I've been praying about this for so long, asking God to show me His will. And every prayer, every sign, every moment of guidance has pointed me toward you. We can be married in God's eyes, Maggie. We can have the spiritual union that matters more than any piece of paper or public ceremony." The way he explained it, with such conviction and spiritual authority, made it sound not just possible, but ordained. This wasn't an affair or a betrayal, this was God's will for our lives. "How would it work?" I asked, still reeling but beginning to consider the impossible. "We'll have our own ceremony," he said, his voice growing warm and excited. "Just you, me, and God. We'll exchange vows in His presence, and that will make us truly married in the way that matters most. To the outside world, you'll remain Maggie Sullivan, a devoted church member, Linda will continue to be seen as my wife. But between us, in our hearts and in God's eyes, we'll be husband and wife. It was overwhelming, confusing, and yet it felt right. This man who had been my spiritual guide, who had shown me God's love when I was at my lowest point, was telling me that God wanted us to be together. How could I question that? I need time to pray about this, I said. Of course, he said, standing up and pulling me to my feet. Take all the time you need. But Maggie, please know that I love you. I love your heart, your dedication, your spirit. I believe with all my soul that God brought us together for this purpose. That night, I went home and prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. I asked God for guidance, for clarity, for some sign that this was truly His will. And as I prayed, I felt a peace settle over me, a sense that yes, this was part of His plan for my life. Looking back now, I can see how naive I was, how desperately I wanted to believe that God had finally given me the love and purpose I'd been searching for my entire life. I can see how Pastor David's spiritual authority, his position as God's representative in my life, made it impossible for me to question his interpretation of God's will. But at the time, it felt like a miracle. It felt like redemption. 3 weeks later, on a cold December evening in 1993, Pastor David Richardson and I were married in the small prayer room behind the church sanctuary. There were no witnesses except God, no rings except the simple band Pastor David placed on my finger to wear hidden beneath my other jewelry. We exchanged vows of love, commitment, and service to each other and to God. And just like that, I became Mrs. Margaret Richardson in spirit, if not in law. That was the beginning of what I believed would be the most blessed chapter of my life. Instead, it was the beginning of 30 years of deception so complete, so carefully crafted, that I lost myself entirely in the lie. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it really unfolded. How the man I trusted most in the world systematically erased my identity and made me complicit in my own disappearance. The months following our spiritual wedding were some of the happiest of my life, even though they were built on a foundation I now know was completely false. Pastor David had convinced me that our love was blessed by God, that our secret union was more sacred than any legal marriage could ever be. Our relationship had to remain hidden, of course. To the congregation, I was still just Maggie Sullivan, the devoted church member who had become indispensable to Pastor David's ministry. But in private, we lived as husband and wife. He would visit me at my small rental house on Elm Street, always with a plausible reason, bringing me church documents to review, discussing upcoming events, or providing pastoral counseling. The greatest servants of God have always had to make sacrifices, he told me one evening as we sat together on my couch, his arm around me, both of us careful to keep the curtains drawn. Look at the disciples. They gave up everything, their families, their old lives, their comfort, to serve a higher purpose. I believed him completely. When he explained that our love had to remain secret to protect the ministry, to avoid scandal that would hurt the congregation's faith, it made perfect sense to me. We were sacrificing our own desires for public recognition to serve God's greater plan. The arrangement seemed to work beautifully at first. Pastor David would spend 2 or 3 evenings a week at my house, and occasionally, he would stay the entire night when he told Linda he was attending ministerial conferences or visiting sick parishioners in distant towns. To anyone watching, he was simply a dedicated pastor who worked long hours serving his flock. Linda understands, he assured me whenever I expressed concern about the deception. She knows that my calling requires sacrifices from both of us. She's chosen to focus on her own spiritual journey while supporting my ministry from the background. I rarely saw Linda during this time. She attended Sunday morning services but usually sat in the back pew and left immediately after the benediction. When I did encounter her at church functions, she was polite but distant, which Pastor David explained was simply her naturally reserved personality. She's always been shy, he told me. Even when we were first married, she preferred to stay home rather than be involved in social activities. It's just her way. In March of 1994, just 3 months after our spiritual wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. I'll never forget the moment I told Pastor David. We were in his church office on a Tuesday evening, going over the budget for the upcoming Easter service, when I found the courage to share the news. David, I said, using the name I was allowed to call him only when we were alone, I have something to tell you. He looked up from the papers scattered across his desk, and something in my tone must have alerted him because his expression immediately became serious. What is it, my dear? I'm going to have a baby. We're gonna have a baby. For a moment, his face went completely blank, and I felt a stab of fear. What if he wasn't happy? What if this complicated everything? But then his face broke into the most radiant smile I'd ever seen. He whispered, coming around the desk to embrace me. This is truly a gift from God, a blessing on our union. We held each other in that small office, and I felt such joy, such completeness. Here was proof that God truly had ordained our relationship. He was blessing us with new life. But then the practical concerns began to surface. How will we handle this? I asked. What will people think? Pastor David took my hands and looked into my eyes with that steady, reassuring gaze that had become so familiar. We'll tell them the truth, just not the whole truth. You'll say that you're pregnant from a relationship that didn't work out, that the father isn't in the picture. It won't be the first time a single woman in our congregation has faced this situation, and our church believes in supporting mothers in need. But people will judge me, I said, tears starting to fall. Some might, he admitted. But Maggie, think about Mary, the mother of Jesus. She was unmarried when she became pregnant. People questioned her, doubted her, whispered about her. But she trusted God's plan. Can you do the same? Once again, he had framed our situation in spiritual terms that made questioning it seem like a lack of faith. Of course I could trust God's plan. Of course I could endure whatever judgment came my way if it meant serving his greater purpose. And so, when I began to show, that's exactly what I did. I told my son Tommy, and anyone else who asked, that I had been involved with someone who was no longer in my life, that I would be raising the baby as a single mother. Some people in the congregation were supportive, offering to help with baby clothes and supplies. Others were less kind, whispering about my poor judgment and loose morals. Pastor David was wonderful throughout my pregnancy. He was attentive and caring in private, always asking about my health, bringing me books about pregnancy and child rearing, making sure I had everything I needed. In public, he was the perfect pastoral figure, concerned for my welfare, as he would be for any single mother in his congregation, but maintaining appropriate boundaries. I want you to know that you have the full support of this church, he announced from the pulpit one Sunday when I was about 6 months along. We are called to care for one another, especially for mothers and children in need. Maggie Sullivan has been a blessing to our congregation, and her child will be welcomed with open arms into our church family. The congregation applauded, and I felt tears of gratitude streaming down my face. Even those who had whispered about me seemed moved by their pastor's words of acceptance and love. Our daughter Sarah was born on November 15, 1994. She was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, with David's blue eyes and my auburn hair. When Pastor David visited me in the hospital, he brought flowers and a card from the church, maintaining his role as caring pastor. But when we were alone for just a moment, he squeezed my hand and whispered, "She's beautiful, just like her mother. I love you both so much." That night, after the nurses had taken Sarah to the nursery and visiting hours were over, David returned to the hospital. He'd told Linda he was visiting another parishioner, and he spent an hour with me and our daughter, holding her, marveling at her tiny features, whispering prayers of thanksgiving. "She's a miracle," he said softly. "Proof of God's blessing on our union. Raising Sarah as a supposedly single mother while maintaining my secret marriage to her father created complications I hadn't anticipated. David couldn't be openly involved in her upbringing, couldn't attend her first steps or birthday parties in any official capacity beyond his role as pastor. But he found ways to be present in our lives. He would stop by my house regularly, always with church business as his excuse, and during these visits, he would spend time with Sarah. He brought her gifts, toys, books, clothes, always framed as donations from the church for a family in need. He was there for her first word, her first step, her first everything, even if he had to pretend it was just coincidence. I wish I could claim her publicly, he told me one evening when Sarah was about 18 months old. We were sitting in my living room, watching her play with blocks on the floor. "I wish the whole world could know that this beautiful little girl is mine. Someday," I said, believing it with all my heart. "When God shows us the right time, when the ministry is ready for the truth, we'll be able to live openly as a family." But someday never came. Instead, 2 years later, I was pregnant again. This time, the announcement was met with less grace from the congregation. When I began to show with my second pregnancy, the whispers were louder, the judgment harsher. "That woman has no shame," I overheard Mrs. Patterson saying to Mrs. Williams in the church bathroom. Getting pregnant again without a husband. What kind of example is she setting? And Pastor David keeps defending her, Mrs. Williams replied. I don't understand why he doesn't counsel her more firmly about her lifestyle choices. Their words stung, but David was there to comfort me, to remind me that Jesus himself was criticized by the religious leaders of his time. They don't understand, he said, holding me as I cried about the congregation's reaction. They can't see what God is doing in our lives, but we know the truth, and that's what matters. Our son Michael was born in August 1996, followed by Daniel in 1998 and our youngest Rebecca in 2000. With each pregnancy, the judgment from some church members grew harsher, but Pastor David's support for me never wavered publicly. He defended me from the pulpit, preached sermons about compassion and not casting the first stone, and made it clear that anyone who couldn't show Christian love to a mother in need wasn't living according to God's will. What I didn't realize until years later was how masterfully he was manipulating the entire situation. By positioning himself as my protector and defender, he was actually reinforcing his own image as a compassionate, Christ-like leader while simultaneously ensuring that no one would ever suspect our true relationship. Who would imagine that the pastor who so publicly supported the unfortunate single mother was actually the father of her children? The years blended together in a strange rhythm of public secrecy and private family life. During the day I was Maggie Sullivan, single mother of 4, devoted church member who somehow managed to keep her family fed and clothed through the generous support of her Christian community. At night, when David could get away, I was Margaret Richardson, wife and mother, living the family life I'd always dreamed of. Our children grew up knowing David as Pastor David, the kind man who visited often and always brought them presents. They had no idea he was their father. When they asked about their daddy, I told them what David and I had agreed upon, that their father was someone who couldn't be part of their lives, but that they were loved and wanted despite his absence. Why can't Daddy be with us? 5-year-old Sarah asked me one day. I knelt down to her level, choosing my words carefully as David had taught me. Sometimes, sweetheart, adults have to make hard choices. Your daddy loves you very much, but he can't live with us right now. But we have Pastor David, and we have our church family, and we have each other. That's what matters. She seemed satisfied with that answer, as children often are when they trust the adults in their lives to handle the complicated things. David was a wonderful father when he could be. He taught Michael to throw a baseball in my backyard during his pastoral visits. He helped Sarah with her homework when he stopped by with church documents for me to review. He read bedtime stories to Daniel and Rebecca when his evening counseling session with me ran late enough for bedtime routines. But he could never be their father officially. He couldn't attend school plays or parent-teacher conferences. He couldn't sign permission slips or be listed on emergency contact forms. When other children talked about their daddies, our children had to say theirs wasn't around. The hardest part was holidays. Christmas morning, Easter Sunday, Father's Day, these were times when families should be together. But David had to be with Linda and maintain his public image. Our children would see him at church, watch him interact with other families, and never know that the man standing at the pulpit was their own father. It breaks my heart too. David would tell me on those lonely holiday afternoons when he could slip away for a few hours. But we have to think about the greater good. The ministry serves hundreds of people. Our sacrifice protects their faith. I believed him. I believed that our love was so pure, so blessed by God, that it required this sacrifice. I believed that someday, when the time was right, we would be able to live openly as the family we truly were. As the children got older, maintaining the secret became more complex. They started asking harder questions, noticing things that didn't quite add up. Why did Pastor David know so much about our family? Why did he always seem to know when we were struggling and needed help? Why did he spend so much time at our house compared to other church families? Pastor David is special. I would tell them. He has a gift from God for caring for people. That's why he's such a good pastor. Meanwhile, my relationship with the congregation remained complicated. There were those who supported me and genuinely cared for my children, and there were others who never stopped viewing me as a cautionary tale. I threw myself into church work even more intensely, as if perfect service could somehow balance out what others saw as my moral failings. I organized every church supper, taught Sunday school for 15 years straight, coordinated the annual Christmas pageant, managed the church's financial records, and basically became David's right hand in all administrative matters. People began to joke that the church couldn't function without me, and they were probably right. "I don't know what we'd do without Maggie," David would say publicly. "She's the most dedicated servant this church has ever known." Privately, he was even more appreciative. "You're amazing," he would tell me as we went over church business together in his office. "You're an incredible mother, a devoted wife, and the most valuable partner anyone could ask for." But I was starting to feel the strain of living two lives. By 2005, I was 45 years old, and the constant secrecy was wearing on me. I was tired of being seen as either a charity case or a cautionary tale. I was tired of my children not having a father they could acknowledge. I was tired of watching Linda Richardson receive the respect and recognition that should have been mine. "When?" I asked David one evening. "When can we finally be honest about what we are? The children are getting older. They deserve to know the truth about their father." David took my hands, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, concern, maybe even fear. "Soon," he said. But his voice lacked the conviction it used to carry. "We just need to wait for the right moment. Linda's health has been declining, and I can't add to her stress right now. And some of the church elders are still traditional in their thinking. We need to be careful about timing." But soon never came. Years passed, and nothing changed except that Linda Richardson seemed to become even more of a recluse, rarely seen in public, while I continued to live in the shadows, raising our 4 children alone while maintaining the fiction that I was nothing more than a devoted single mother and church volunteer. Looking back, I can see that David was never going to reveal our relationship. The arrangement worked too well for him. He had a devoted wife who served his every need and asked for nothing in return. Children he could love in private without any of the public responsibilities of fatherhood, and a congregation that saw him as a compassionate leader who cared for the less fortunate. But at the time, I trusted him completely. I believed that our patience would be rewarded, that God's timing was perfect, and that eventually, justice and truth would prevail. I had no idea that the truth, when it finally came, would be more devastating than any lie I'd ever been told. By 2010, our youngest child, Rebecca, was 10 years old, and I was 50 years old myself. I'd been living this double life for 17 years, and the weight of it was becoming harder to bear with each passing day. What had once felt like a blessed secret now felt like a prison of my own making. The children were asking harder questions, and I was running out of believable answers. Sarah, now 15, was particularly persistent. "Mom, why does Pastor David know so much about our family?" she asked one evening after David had left from one of his counseling visits. "Like, he knew that I was worried about my history test tomorrow, but I never told him that. And he brought Rebecca that specific book she wanted for her birthday. How did he even know she wanted it?" I felt my stomach clench. Sarah had always been observant, but as she'd gotten older, her questions had become more pointed. "Pastor David cares about all the families in our church," I said, using the same explanation I'd been giving for years. "He pays attention to what people need." "But Mom," Sarah pressed, "it doesn't visit the other families like this. Jenny's mom says their pastor only visits when someone's sick or there's a crisis. Pastor David comes here like family." The word hung in the air between us, and I felt my cheeks burn. "He's been very good to us, Sarah. We should be grateful for his guidance and support." But Sarah wasn't satisfied, and neither were her younger brothers. Michael, now 14, had started making comments about how weird it was that Pastor David knew so much about our personal lives. Daniel, 12, had asked why Pastor David always seemed to have money to help us when we needed it. And Rebecca, sweet 10-year-old Rebecca, had started calling him almost like a daddy when talking to her friends. Each comment, each question, each innocent observation felt like a crack in the carefully constructed wall that David and I had built around our secret, and I was terrified of what would happen if that wall ever came tumbling down. My relationship with David was changing too. The passionate love I'd felt in the early years had settled into something more complicated. I still loved him, or I thought I did, but I was beginning to resent the limitations of our life together. I was 50 years old, and I'd never been on a real date, never been taken to dinner in public, never been introduced as anyone's girlfriend or wife. I existed in the spaces between David's real life, always secondary to his public image, and his marriage to Linda. "I'm tired of hiding," I told him one evening in early 2011. We were in my kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. The children were in their rooms doing homework, and David was preparing to leave for another night at home with Linda. "What do you mean?" he asked, though I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what I meant. "I mean, I'm tired of being your secret, David. I'm tired of my children not knowing who their father is. I'm tired of living like we're doing something wrong when you've told me for 18 years that this is God's will." David set down the dish towel and turned to face me fully. "Maggie, you know how much I wish things could be different, but Linda's condition has gotten worse. Her heart problems, her depression, the doctor says any major stress could literally kill her. How can I be responsible for that?" This was a new element he'd introduced over the past few years, Linda's supposedly fragile health that made any revelation of our relationship potentially fatal to her. It was a perfect manipulation because it made me feel guilty for even wanting acknowledgement of our family. "But what about our children's health?" I shot back, surprising myself with my boldness. "What about the damage we're doing to them by making them live this lie?" "It's not a lie," David said firmly, using the authoritative tone that used to silence all my doubts. "It's a complicated truth that requires wisdom to handle properly." "When?" I asked, the question I'd been asking for years. "When will the timing finally be right? When will Linda be strong enough? When will the church be ready? When will our children finally get to know their father?" David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler. "I know this is hard, Maggie. I know you're making tremendous sacrifices. But think about everything we've built here. Think about the ministry, the people we've helped, the lives we've touched. Is it worth destroying all of that for our personal happiness?" There it was again, the implication that wanting acknowledgement of our relationship was selfish. That putting our children's needs first was somehow a betrayal of God's greater plan. For 18 years, this argument had worked on me. But something was starting to shift in my thinking. "Maybe," I said quietly, "or personal happiness matters too. Maybe our children's right to know their father matters too." David looked startled by my response. He'd grown accustomed to my eventual surrender whenever we had this conversation. "Maggie," he said, reaching for my hands, "don't let doubt creep into your heart. Don't let the enemy make you question what God has ordained." But doubt had already crept in, and it was growing stronger every day. The breaking point came in the spring of 2011, during Rebecca's school play. She was playing the lead role in her fourth-grade production of Annie, and she was so excited about it. For weeks, she'd been talking about how she hoped her whole family could come watch her perform. "Can Pastor David come too?" she asked me the week before the play. "He's been helping me practice my lines when he visits." "I'll ask him," I said, knowing that David wouldn't be able to attend without raising questions about his special interest in my daughter. When I brought up the play during one of David's visits, his expression immediately became apologetic. "I wish I could, Maggie. But you know I can't show that kind of favoritism to one family without people asking questions. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to attend a school function for your daughter specifically." "She's not just my daughter," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "She's your daughter too. You know that's not how the world sees it," he replied. "And we have to be careful about appearances." The night of the play, I sat in that elementary school auditorium with my 3 other children, watching my baby girl shine on stage, and I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. All around me were families, mothers and fathers together, proudly watching their children perform. And there I was, a 50-year-old woman whose children's father couldn't even acknowledge them publicly enough to attend their school play. Rebecca was magnificent. She sang with confidence, delivered her lines perfectly, and brought the house down with her performance. During the curtain call, I saw her scanning the audience, and I knew she was looking for David. When she didn't see him, her face fell just a little bit, and something in my heart broke. After the play, as we were walking to the car, Rebecca said, "I wish Pastor David could have come. I wanted him to see me sing." "He wanted to be here, sweetheart," I said, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. "He had church business to take care of." But Michael, now 15 and increasingly skeptical of everything, said, "Church business? On a Tuesday night, that's convenient." Sarah shot him a warning look, but the damage was done. Even my children were starting to question the stories I'd been telling them for their entire lives. That night, after I'd tucked the children into bed, I sat in my living room and really looked at my life for the first time in years. I was 50 years old, had 4 children, and had devoted nearly 20 years to a relationship that required me to pretend it didn't exist. I had no legal protections, no financial security beyond what David chose to provide through church charity, no recognition as a wife or partner, and no hope of ever having anything different. Meanwhile, Linda Richardson, the woman whose place I'd taken in every way that mattered, got to be acknowledged as the pastor's wife. She got the respect, the recognition, the social status. And what did I get? Secret visits, hidden affection, and the privilege of raising David's children while pretending they were the result of my own moral failings. For the first time, I began to wonder if I'd been a fool. The doubts grew stronger over the following months. I started paying more attention to things I'd ignored before, like how Linda Richardson was rarely seen in public, how she never seemed to participate in any church activities, how the few times I'd encountered her over the years, she'd seemed more absent than present. I also started noticing things about David that I'd explained away before, like how he always had elaborate stories about where he'd been when he wasn't with me or at church events, like how he never let me call him at home, always insisting he would call me, like how he seemed to know exactly what to say to keep me from pushing too hard for change. "I love you, Maggie," he would say whenever I expressed frustration with our situation. "You and our children are the most important things in my world. But we have to be patient. God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't feel that way to us." But I was starting to question whether this was really God's timing or just David's convenience. The final straw came in late 2011, when Sarah started her senior year of high school. She was applying to colleges, and as part of the process, she needed to fill out financial aid forms that required information about her father. "What do I put here?" she asked me, pointing to the section about paternal information. "I don't know anything about my dad." I stared at the form, realizing that my 17-year-old daughter was going to have to lie on official government documents because her father couldn't acknowledge her existence. "Just put father unknown," I said, the words feeling like poison in my mouth. "Father unknown?" Sarah repeated. "But you've always said he wasn't in the picture, not that you didn't know who he was." I scrambled for an explanation. "I meant that his information isn't available for the forms. It's complicated, sweetheart." But Sarah wasn't a child anymore. She was a smart, perceptive young woman, and she could see through the weak explanations I'd been giving her for years. "Mom," she said, setting down the forms and looking at me directly, "I need to know the truth. I'm 18 years old in a few months. I'm going to college. I need to understand what's really going on with our family." I felt panic rise in my chest. This was the moment I'd been dreading for years, the moment when the lies became impossible to maintain. "Your father," I began, then stopped. What could I say? That he was a married man who'd convinced me to have a secret spiritual marriage. That he was the pastor of our church who visited us regularly but couldn't acknowledge his own children. That I'd been living a lie for nearly 20 years and had made her complicit in it. "Your father made choices that prevent him from being part of your life," I said finally. "But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you." "What kind of choices?" Sarah pressed. "Is he married to someone else? Is that why he can't be here?" The accuracy of her guess took my breath away. Yes, it's complicated in that way." Sarah stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her putting pieces together in her mind. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Mom, please tell me you weren't having an affair with a married man." "It wasn't an affair," I said quickly. It is, we're married in God's eyes, Sarah. It's just that the world doesn't understand. Married in God's eyes." Sarah's voice rose. "Mom? That's what people say when they're having an affair with someone who won't leave their spouse?" Her words hit me like a physical blow because somewhere deep down, I'd started to suspect she might be right. "You don't understand," I said desperately. "Pastor David explained it all to me. God called us to this relationship. It's blessed. It's ordained." I stopped mid-sentence, realizing what I'd just revealed. Sarah's face went white. "Pastor David," she whispered. "Our Pastor David?" The secret I'd kept for 18 years spilled out in that moment of panic, and there was no taking it back. "Pastor David is our father." Sarah's voice was shaking. "The man who's been visiting us all these years, the man I've been calling Pastor David my entire life, is actually my father." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. The wall I'd built around our secret life had just collapsed completely. "Mom," Sarah said, tears starting to flow, "how could you do this to us? How could you let us live this lie?" That night, after Sarah had gone to her room and refused to speak to me further, I called David in desperation. "We need to talk," I said when he answered. "Sarah knows," She figured it out, and I couldn't keep lying to her. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'll be right over," he said finally. But when David arrived an hour later, he didn't come as my husband rushing to help his family through a crisis. He came as a pastor whose reputation was suddenly in danger. "How much does she know?" were his first words. "She knows you're their father. She knows about us." David ran his hands through his hair, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "This is a disaster, Maggie. If this gets out, it will destroy everything: the church, my ministry, my marriage. Everything we've worked for." "What about our children?" I asked. "What about the damage this has done to them?" "We'll figure something out," he said, but his tone suggested he was already calculating damage control rather than thinking about our family's well-being. For the first time in nearly 20 years, I looked at David Richardson and didn't see my beloved husband or my spiritual guide. I saw a man who was more concerned about protecting his reputation than about the pain his lies had caused his own children. That was the night I began to realize that everything I'd believed about our relationship, about God's plan for our lives, about the sacrifice we were making for the greater good, might have been a carefully constructed deception designed to serve David's needs while systematically erasing mine. But I still had no idea just how deep that deception ran, or how much of my life had been built on lies I was only beginning to understand. The weeks following Sarah's discovery were the most difficult of my life up to that point. My eldest daughter could barely look at me, and when she did speak to me, it was with a mixture of hurt and disgust that broke my heart. "How could you lie to us our entire lives?" she asked me one morning before school, her voice cold in a way I'd never heard from her before. "How could you make us believe our father abandoned us when he's been here all along, pretending to be something else?" I tried to explain, tried to make her understand the complicated spiritual situation that David had convinced me was God's will, but everything I said sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Mom, listen to yourself," Sarah said, her voice rising. "You're talking about spiritual marriage and God's plan, but what you're describing is an affair. A decades-long affair that produced 4 children who have been forced to lie about their own existence." Her words stung because somewhere deep inside, I was starting to suspect she was right. The situation became even more complicated when Sarah confronted her younger siblings. I wasn't there when it happened. I was at work at the grocery store where I'd been employed part-time for years, but when I came home, I found all 4 of my children in the living room, with Sarah clearly having just finished explaining everything to Michael, Daniel, and Rebecca. "Is it true?" Michael asked me, his 15-year-old voice cracking with emotion. "Is Pastor David really our dad?" Rebecca, only 11 years old, was crying. "Why didn't Pastor David tell us he was our daddy? Why did we have to pretend?" I sat down with my children and tried to explain, but every word I spoke seemed to make things worse. "How do you tell your children that their father couldn't acknowledge them? Because it would hurt his reputation. How do you explain that you'd agreed to this arrangement because you thought it was God's will?" "This is messed up, Mom," Daniel said, and at 12 years old, he was using language he'd learned from his older brothers. "This is really messed up." The children's reactions varied. Sarah was angry at me, at David, at the entire situation. Michael alternated between fury and heartbreak, sometimes raging about the lies we'd told him, and sometimes crying about the father he'd never really had. Daniel seemed mostly confused, trying to process how the man he'd known as Pastor David was actually his father. And Rebecca, my baby, just seemed lost and hurt. "Can I call him Daddy now?" she asked one evening. "Since we all know the truth." "It's complicated, sweetie," I said, realizing how ridiculous that sounded. Everything in our lives was complicated, because David had made it that way. David, meanwhile, was in full damage control mode. He came to the house more frequently in the days following Sarah's discovery, but not as a father finally able to acknowledge his children. Instead, he came as a man trying to manage a crisis that threatened his carefully constructed life. "We need to make sure this doesn't go beyond this house," he told me during one of his visits, speaking in hushed tones while the children were upstairs. "If word gets out to the congregation, it will destroy everything." "What about our children?" I asked, my patience finally wearing thin after 20 years of putting David's concerns above my family's needs. "What about the damage this has already done to them?" "We'll work through that," he said dismissively. "Children are resilient. They'll understand eventually that we were protecting them." "Protecting them from what?" from having a father who acknowledged them, from living honestly. David's expression hardened, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, not the loving spiritual leader who'd guided me for 2 decades, but something cold and calculating. Maggie, you need to think very carefully about what you're saying, about what you're suggesting. This family, your family, depends entirely on my support. Your job at the grocery store barely covers your utilities. Where do you think the money for your mortgage comes from? For the children's clothes and school supplies? For the car repairs and medical bills? The threat was clear, and it shocked me to my core. After 20 years of believing our relationship was blessed by God, he was essentially telling me that my family's survival depended on my continued cooperation with his deception. Are you threatening me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm reminding you of reality, he said. I'm reminding you that actions have consequences, and that you have 4 children depending on you to make wise decisions. That night, after David left to go home to Linda, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and really confronted the truth for the first time in 20 years. This wasn't a blessed spiritual union. This wasn't God's plan for my life. This was a relationship where a man in a position of power had used my faith, my vulnerability, and my desire to serve God to manipulate me into a situation that served his needs while leaving me with no power, no security, and no recognition. But even as I began to understand the reality of my situation, I felt trapped. David was right about one thing: my family did depend on his financial support. My part-time job at the grocery store paid maybe $800 a month. The house we lived in was owned by the church, and while I'd always been told it was provided as charity for a family in need, I was starting to wonder if it wasn't actually a way to keep me dependent and controllable. The children, meanwhile, were struggling with their new reality in different ways. Sarah had decided she wanted nothing to do with David anymore. He's not my father, she told me firmly. A father doesn't hide from his children for 18 years. A father doesn't make his children lie about who they are. He's just a man who got you pregnant and then abandoned us emotionally while pretending to be holy. Michael was angrier. He started acting out at school, getting into fights, talking back to teachers. When the school called to discuss his behavior, I realized I couldn't even put his real father down as an emergency contact because David couldn't risk his involvement becoming public. Daniel seemed to be retreating into himself, becoming quieter and more withdrawn, and Rebecca kept asking when she could tell her friends at school that Pastor David was her daddy, not understanding why it had to remain a secret, because grown-ups make things complicated sometimes. I told her, hating myself for giving her yet another non-answer. 3 months after the truth came out to the children, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to confront Linda Richardson. I had barely spoken to Linda in 20 years. She was a virtual ghost in the church community, rarely seen except for Sunday morning services, and even then she usually sat in the back and left quickly. But I needed to understand my situation better, free, and I needed to hear from her own lips what she knew about David's relationship with me. I found her address in the church directory and drove to the Richardson house on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew David would be at the church for his weekly board meeting. My hands were shaking as I rang the doorbell. The woman who answered the door was not the Linda Richardson I remembered from 20 years ago. She was thin to the point of being gaunt, with hollow eyes and graying hair that looked like it hadn't been styled in months. She looked older than her 62 years, and there was something vacant about her expression. "Mrs. Richardson," I said. "I'm Maggie Sullivan from the church. I was wondering if I could speak with you for a few minutes." Her eyes focused on me with some difficulty, as if she was having trouble placing who I was. "Maggie Sullivan?" she repeated slowly. "You're the woman with all the children." "Yes," I said. "That's right." She stood there for a moment, then stepped aside to let me in. The interior of the Richardson house was shocking. It was clean but sparse, with very little furniture and almost no personal touches. It looked more like a temporary residence than a family home where people had lived for decades. "Would you like some tea?" Linda asked, her voice flat and distant. "That would be nice. Thank you." As she moved around the kitchen preparing tea, I watched her carefully. There was something wrong here. Something that didn't match the story David had been telling me for 20 years about his wife, who understood our spiritual marriage. "Mrs. Richardson," I said carefully, "I wanted to ask you about something. About your marriage to David." She looked at me with those hollow eyes, and for a moment, I thought she hadn't heard me. David? She repeated. Yes, David is my husband. I know this might sound strange, I continued, but has David ever talked to you about other relationships? About his feelings for other people in the congregation? Linda set down the teacups and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. Other people, she said, and there was something almost childlike about the way she spoke. David says I'm not supposed to think about other people. David says I need to focus on my health and let him worry about everything else. A chill ran down my spine. Mrs. Richardson, how long have you been feeling unwell? Oh, a long time, she said vaguely. Years and years. David takes good care of me, though. He gives me my medicine every day to help me feel better. What kind of medicine? I'm not sure, she said, looking confused. Little white pills. David says they're very important for my condition. He says I might get very sick without them, maybe even die. I felt like the ground was shifting under my feet. Mrs. Richardson, when was the last time you saw a doctor on your own? Without David, she looked at me blankly. I don't go to doctors. David says I'm too fragile for that kind of stress. He takes care of everything medical for me. As I sat in that sparse, lonely house, talking to this hollow-eyed woman who spoke about her husband like he was her caretaker rather than her spouse, I began to understand that David's deception was far more extensive than I'd ever imagined. Linda Richardson wasn't the understanding wife who knew about our spiritual marriage and supported it. She was a woman who had been systematically isolated, medicated, and controlled to the point where she barely seemed present in her own life. Mrs. Richardson, I said gently, do you remember me from church? Do you remember seeing me there over the years? Sometimes I remember church, she said. But David says I get confused about things. He says my memory isn't very good anymore because of my condition. I stayed for another hour, asking careful questions and getting answers that painted a horrifying picture. Linda hadn't had friends in years because David said social interaction was too stressful for her condition. She didn't drive because David said her medication made it unsafe. She didn't handle any of their finances because David said numbers confused her. She didn't even answer the phone because David said unexpected calls might upset her fragile nerves. As I drove home from that visit, I finally understood the full scope of what David had done. He hadn't just manipulated me into a secret relationship, he had systematically destroyed his wife's ability to function independently, turning her into a controlled, medicated shadow of a person so that she couldn't interfere with his other life. And if he could do that to the woman he'd legally married, what did that say about what he was capable of doing to me? That night, I called David and told him I'd visited Linda. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. You did what? He said finally, and his voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. I went to see Linda. I needed to understand what she knew about us, about our relationship. Maggie, you have no idea what you've done. Linda is very ill. She's fragile. If you've upset her, if you've caused her to have an episode. She didn't seem upset. I interrupted. She seemed drugged, David. She seemed like a woman who's been medicated into submission. Another long silence. I think we need to have a very serious conversation, David said finally. I'll be over in an hour. But when David arrived at my house that night, he didn't come alone. He brought Elder Thomas from the church board and another man I didn't recognize. Maggie? David said, his voice taking on the authoritative pastoral tone he used from the pulpit. I'm very concerned about your mental state lately. Elder Thomas agrees that you may be having some kind of breakdown that's causing you to have delusions about our relationship. I stared at him in shock. After 20 years of secret marriage, after 4 children together, he was now claiming that I was delusional about our relationship. Elder Thomas, I said, turning to the older man, surely you know that Pastor David and I have been close for many years. I know you've been a devoted church member, Maggie. Elder Thomas said kindly but firmly. And I know Pastor David has been very generous in providing charitable support to you and your children. But this idea that you have some kind of romantic relationship with him, that's simply not possible. Pastor David is a man of God, devoted to his wife and his ministry. The ground was disappearing beneath my feet. These men were looking at me like I was a crazy woman, making accusations against their beloved pastor. And David was standing there, nodding along with their assessment, as if the past 20 years had never happened. I want you both to leave, I said, my voice shaking. Now, Maggie, David said, his voice taking on a condescending tone. You're clearly not thinking clearly. Perhaps you should consider getting some professional help for these delusions. After they left, I sat in my living room with my 4 children, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand that their father had just denied their existence to the church leadership. "He called you crazy," Sarah said, her voice filled with a fury I'd never heard from her before. "Free. He brought witnesses to make it seem like you made the whole thing up." And that's when I realized that David Richardson wasn't just a man who had manipulated me into a secret relationship. He was a predator who had spent 20 years systematically destroying my credibility, my independence, and my sense of reality, all while positioning himself as a saint who charitably supported a delusional single mother. But I also realized something else that night. I might be trapped, I might be financially dependent on him, and I might be facing a battle against a man who had far more power and credibility than I did. But I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't going to let him destroy my children the way he'd destroyed Linda. The war for my family's truth was about to begin. After David's gaslighting attempt with the church elders, I realized that I was in a battle for my sanity, my children's well-being, and the truth itself. But I also knew that I was fighting a man who had 20 years of practice in manipulation, a sterling reputation in the community, and the institutional power of the church behind him. I had to be smart about this. I had to be strategic. The first thing I did was call my eldest daughter Sarah, who was now in her first year of college. She'd been struggling with anger and hurt since learning the truth about her father. But when I told her about David's attempt to make me look delusional, something shifted in her. "Mom," she said over the phone, "I'm a social work major. I'm learning about psychological abuse, manipulation tactics, gaslighting. What he's doing to you, what he's been doing to you for 20 years, it's textbook predatory behavior." Having my educated, intelligent daughter validate what I was experiencing gave me the first real confidence I'd felt in months. "But Sarah," I said, "how do I prove what happened? I don't have any evidence. Everything was secret, everything was hidden. And now he's claiming it never happened at all." "We'll find evidence, Mom. Predators like him always leave traces. They can't control every detail over 20 years. And besides, you have 4 children who are living proof that something happened between you two." Sarah came home that weekend, and together we started building a case. She had learned research skills in college, and she approached our situation like the social work case it was. "First," she said, "we need to document everything. Every interaction you've had with him, every time he's provided financial support, every time he's visited our house. We need dates, amounts, witnesses when possible." I started writing. 20 years of memories poured onto page after page, specific conversations, specific gifts he'd brought the children, specific times he'd helped with homework or attended school events in unofficial capacities. The sheer volume of documentation was overwhelming. "Look at this, Mom," Sarah said, reviewing what I'd written. "No pastor provides this level of ongoing, intimate support to one family unless there's a personal relationship. This isn't charity, this is a man supporting his secret family." But we needed more than my memories. We needed tangible proof. "What about financial records?" Sarah asked. "You said he's been supporting us financially for years. Where did that money come from? How did it get to you?" I thought about the various ways David had provided financial support over the years. Sometimes it was cash in envelopes, supposedly from anonymous church donations. Sometimes it was checks from the church's discretionary fund. Sometimes it was direct payments for things like school supplies or medical bills. "The church," I said suddenly. "The church has financial records. They have to keep track of where their money goes. Even discretionary funds." "Exactly," Sarah said. "And I bet if we looked at those records, we'd see a pattern of payments to our family that goes way beyond normal charitable giving." We also realized that Linda Richardson's condition could be crucial evidence. If David had been systematically medicating and isolating his wife to prevent her from interfering with his other life, that was a crime that went far beyond adultery or spiritual manipulation. "We need to get Linda help," Sarah said. "If she's being abused, and what you described sounds like severe psychological and possibly medical abuse, we have a responsibility to report it." But approaching Linda again would be dangerous. David would be watching for any further contact between us after my first visit had clearly alarmed him. That's when Michael, now 16 and filled with righteous anger about his father's denial of him, came up with an idea. "What if I went to see her?" he said. "I could say I was doing a school project about the history of the church, and I wanted to interview the pastor's wife about what the community was like 20 years ago. It was risky, but it might work. Michael was mature for his age, and his anger at David had given him a clarity about the situation that was remarkable. 3 weeks later, Michael came back from visiting Linda Richardson with information that confirmed our worst fears and gave us the ammunition we needed. "Mom," he said, his face pale but determined. "She's in really bad shape, worse than when you saw her. She kept falling asleep while we were talking, and when she was awake, she was really confused. She kept asking me who I was and why I was there." But Michael had managed to learn some crucial information during Linda's more lucid moments. "She told me that David gives her medicine every morning and every night," he said. "She said she's been taking it for many years because David told her she had a heart condition that could kill her if she didn't take her pills." "Did she say what kind of pills?" "She didn't know. But Mom, here's the thing, she said she's never been to a doctor. Not once since they moved to Cedar Falls 22 years ago. David told her that her condition was too rare for regular doctors to understand, so he handles all her medical care himself." My blood ran cold. A man with no medical training had been medicating his wife for over 2 decades, telling her it was necessary to keep her alive, while simultaneously isolating her from anyone who might question her treatment. "There's more," Michael continued. "I asked her about old photos, and she showed me this wedding album from when they got married. Mom, in the early pictures, she looks completely normal, happy, alert, engaged. But there are pictures from different years, and you can see her getting more and more vacant, like the person behind her eyes was slowly disappearing. That evening, I made a decision that terrified me, but felt absolutely necessary. I called the Department of Social Services and reported Linda Richardson as a vulnerable adult who might be experiencing abuse. I need to report a situation where an elderly woman may be being systematically medicated and isolated by her husband," I told the intake worker. The investigation that followed was the beginning of the end for David Richardson's carefully constructed life. Within a week, Adult Protective Services had visited Linda Richardson and discovered that she had indeed been given powerful psychiatric medications for years without proper medical supervision. The bottles in her medicine cabinet contained drugs that required careful monitoring and regular blood tests, monitoring that had never occurred. When investigators tried to reach Linda's doctor to understand her medical history, they discovered that there was no doctor. David had been obtaining the medications through illegal online pharmacies and had been adjusting her dosages based on his own desires to keep her compliant and isolated. The criminal investigation that began with Adult Protective Services soon expanded to include the church's financial records, and that's where the house of cards really began to tumble. The church's books showed years of irregular payments to my family that far exceeded any reasonable charitable giving. More damning, they showed that David had been using church funds to pay for our mortgage, our car payments, and numerous other expenses. The total amount over 20 years was staggering, nearly $400,000 in church money that had essentially been used to support his secret family. But David wasn't going down without a fight. When the investigators began asking questions at the church, he immediately went into crisis management mode. He called an emergency meeting of the church board and told them that I was a mentally unstable woman who had developed an obsession with him over the years. "I've tried to help this troubled family out of Christian charity," he told the board, according to Elder Thomas, who later shared the details with investigators. "But I'm afraid that Mrs. Sullivan has misinterpreted my pastoral care as something romantic. Her accusations are the delusions of a woman who needs serious psychiatric help." He was so convincing that initially, most of the board believed him. After all, he was their respected pastor of 22 years, and I was just a single mother with a reputation for poor judgment. But then Sarah did something brilliant. She had been researching David's background, trying to find out more about his history before he came to Cedar Falls. What she discovered was that David Richardson had been the pastor of another church in a different state before coming to us, a church he'd left suddenly after only 3 years. With help from a private investigator she found online, Sarah tracked down members of that previous congregation. What they told her was chilling. David had left his previous church amid rumors of an inappropriate relationship with a young woman in his congregation, a woman who had mysteriously disappeared from the community just before David's departure. The church leadership had quietly encouraged David to seek opportunities elsewhere, rather than face public scandal. Armed with this information, Sarah contacted a local news reporter who specialized in investigative journalism. She laid out the entire story, the financial irregularities, Linda's suspected abuse, the pattern of predatory behavior that seemed to span multiple decades and locations. The reporter was initially skeptical. Accusations against respected religious leaders were serious business, and newspapers had to be very careful about libel laws. But when Sarah showed him the financial records we'd obtained through the criminal investigation, and when he spoke to the Adult Protective Services worker handling Linda's case, he realized this was a legitimate story. The article was published on a Thursday morning in late spring 2012. The headline read, "Local Pastor Under Investigation for Fraud and Abuse." By that afternoon, David Richardson's 22-year ministry at Cornerstone Baptist Church was over. The congregation was in chaos. Some members refused to believe the allegations, insisting that David was being persecuted by enemies of the faith. Others, however, began to come forward with their own stories of things that had never quite made sense. David's secretiveness about his personal life, his wife's strange absence from church activities, his unusually close relationship with my family. Mrs. Henderson, the elder's wife who had once commented on how well David and I worked together, approached me after the story broke. "I always wondered," she said quietly. "You and your children, there was something familiar about the way you all looked. And Pastor David always seemed to know so much about your family's needs. It makes sense now, but not everyone was supportive. A significant portion of the congregation turned against me, viewing me as the woman who had destroyed their beloved pastor. I received angry phone calls, nasty letters, and even had my car vandalized. Jezebel, someone spray painted across my garage door. War of Babylon. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being called a seductress and a whore for a relationship that I'd been convinced was a blessed spiritual marriage ordained by God. The criminal charges against David were serious. He was facing fraud charges for his misuse of church funds, and more seriously, he was facing charges of criminal abuse of a vulnerable adult for what he'd done to Linda. But even as the legal system began to work, I realized that my fight wasn't really about punishing David. It was about reclaiming my truth, my identity, and my children's right to know who they really were. The hardest part was still ahead of me, learning to live as myself after 20 years of being who David Richardson needed me to be. Learning to make decisions based on my own judgment rather than his spiritual authority. Learning to trust my own perceptions of reality after years of being told that my thoughts and feelings were wrong. And most importantly, learning to help my children heal from the damage that had been done by growing up in a lie. But for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I was fighting for something that mattered more than David's reputation, or the church's comfort, or even my own security. I was fighting for the truth. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, the truth was finally beginning to win. The months following the newspaper article were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and emotional upheaval that I could never have prepared for. David Richardson's fall from grace was swift and complete, but the aftermath was far more complicated than I had anticipated. Within days of the story breaking, David was arrested on multiple charges. The financial fraud charges alone were staggering. The state attorney general's office had taken over the case, and they'd uncovered not just the $400,000 in church funds that had been used to support my family, but additional irregularities going back to the beginning of his ministry in Cedar Falls. David had been living a lifestyle far beyond what a small town pastor's salary should have supported. The house where he and Linda lived was purchased with church money, supposedly as a parsonage but titled in David's personal name. He had expensive vehicles, took lavish trips that he claimed were ministry-related but were actually personal vacations, and had been systematically skimming from church accounts for over 2 decades. But the charges related to Linda's abuse were even more serious. When Adult Protective Services removed Linda from David's custody and placed her in a medical facility for evaluation, the full extent of what he'd done to her became clear. Linda had been given powerful psychiatric medications, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, and sedatives in combinations and dosages that would have required careful medical supervision under normal circumstances. David had been obtaining these drugs illegally and administering them to his wife for over 15 years, gradually increasing the doses to keep her more and more compliant. Dr. Sarah Chun, the psychiatrist who evaluated Linda after her removal from David's custody, explained the situation to me during the legal proceedings. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said. What was done to Mrs. Richardson amounts to chemical imprisonment. She was deliberately kept in a state of confusion and dependency that made it impossible for her to function independently or seek help. The most heartbreaking part was that Linda's baseline mental health had been completely normal before David began medicating her. She had no underlying psychiatric condition that required treatment. The heart condition David claimed she suffered from was entirely fictional. She was essentially kidnapped in her own life. Dr. Chen continued, and the truly tragic part is that some of the cognitive damage from years of inappropriate medication may be permanent. We're weaning her off the drugs slowly, and she's becoming more alert and oriented, but she may never fully recover who she was before this abuse began. When I learned this, I felt a crushing guilt that took my breath away. For 20 years, I had known that Linda was David's wife, and I had allowed myself to believe that she was somehow complicit in our arrangement. I had convinced myself that she understood and accepted David's relationship with me because he had told me so. The truth was that Linda had been systematically destroyed to prevent her from interfering with David's ability to maintain his secret family. She had been the first victim of his manipulation, not a willing participant in it. I visited Linda in the care facility where she was recovering, something I should have done years earlier if I hadn't been so completely under David's control. She was sitting in a sunny common room when I arrived, looking more alert than I'd ever seen her, though still fragile and confused about many things. When I approached her, she recognized me. "You're Maggie," she said, her voice clearer than it had been during my previous visit to her home. "From the church." "Yes," I said, sitting down beside her. "Linda, I wanted to talk to you about David, about what he did to both of us." Her eyes focused on me with an intensity that was startling. "He told me you were having problems," she said slowly. "He said you were confused about him, that you thought he cared about you more than he did." My heart broke for both of us. Even in his manipulation of Linda, David had been planting seeds to discredit me if I ever tried to tell the truth. "Linda," I said gently, "David and I had a relationship for 20 years. We have 4 children together. But he told me that you knew about it, that you had agreed to it." Linda stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process this information through the fog of years of medication. "Children," she repeated. "You have children with David?" "Yes, 4 children. Sarah is 18 now, Michael is 16, Daniel is 14, and Rebecca is 12. Linda was quiet for several minutes, and I could see her working through the implications of what I was telling her. "I wanted children," she said finally, tears starting to flow. "When David and I got married, we talked about having a family. But then he said I was too sick, too fragile. He said it wouldn't be safe for me to have children." The cruelty of what David had done hit me with full force. He hadn't just stolen Linda's ability to function independently, he had stolen her chance at motherhood while simultaneously creating the family with me that should have been hers. "I'm so sorry, Linda," I said, tears streaming down my own face. "I'm so sorry that he did this to you, to both of us." Linda reached over and took my hand, and in that moment, I realized that we weren't rivals or enemies. We were both survivors of the same predator, and our healing would have to acknowledge the pain we had both endured. The criminal trial began in the fall of 2012. David pleaded not guilty to all charges, and his defense attorney tried to paint me as an unstable woman who had seduced their client and was now trying to destroy him out of spite. But the evidence was overwhelming. The financial records spoke for themselves, and Linda's medical records, or rather, the complete absence of legitimate medical records, told a clear story of systematic abuse. The most powerful moment in the trial came when Sarah testified. At 19 years old, she was poised, articulate, and completely unshakable under cross-examination. "Mr. Richardson was my father," she told the court with absolute certainty. "Not legally, not officially, but biologically and in every way that should have mattered. He knew when my first tooth came in. He taught me to ride a bicycle in our backyard. He helped me with my math homework for years. But he did all of this in secret, and he denied our existence when it became inconvenient for him." The defense attorney tried to suggest that Sarah was confused about David's role in her life, that she was misinterpreting normal pastoral care as something more personal. Sarah responded with a strength that made me proud. "I'm studying social work in college. I understand the difference between appropriate pastoral care and a man secretly fathering children with a member of his congregation. What happened in our family was not pastoral care. It was exploitation of my mother's faith and vulnerability. Michael, Daniel, and Rebecca also testified, each in their own way confirming the intimate, ongoing relationship David had maintained with our family for their entire lives. Rebecca, at 12, was the most heartbreaking witness. "I just want people to know that Pastor David is my daddy," she said simply. "I don't understand why he said he wasn't. Daddies aren't supposed to lie about loving their children." David's own testimony was a disaster for his defense. He tried to maintain the fiction that his relationship with me was purely pastoral. But he couldn't explain away the financial support, the intimate knowledge of our family's daily life, or the obvious physical resemblance between him and our children. When the prosecutor asked him directly if he was the biological father of my 4 children, David hesitated for a long moment before saying, "I don't believe that I am." "You don't believe that you are?" the prosecutor pressed. "Mr. Richardson, have you ever taken a paternity test?" "No," David admitted. "Are you willing to take one now?" Another long hesitation. "I don't think that would be appropriate." The jury saw through his evasions immediately. After deliberating for less than 4 hours, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. David Richardson was sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud and criminal abuse of a vulnerable adult. The judge's comments during sentencing stayed with me. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Martinez said, "you held a position of sacred trust in your community. People looked to you for moral guidance and spiritual leadership. Instead, you used that trust to exploit vulnerable women and steal from the very people who supported you. The damage you have done to Mrs. Sullivan, to Mrs. Richardson, to 4 innocent children, and to an entire congregation that believed in you is immeasurable." But even with David behind bars, the consequences of his actions continued to ripple through all our lives. The church was forced to close. The financial scandal had destroyed their ability to function, and the congregation was too divided and traumatized to continue. Some members blamed me for bringing down their church, while others finally began to see David for what he had always been. My children struggled with the public nature of our story. Having your family's most private secrets splashed across newspaper headlines and discussed on local television is devastating for anyone, but especially for teenagers and children who had to face their classmates and teachers after such revelations. Michael, in particular, went through a difficult period of anger and rebellion. "Why did you let him do this to us?" he asked me one night. "Why didn't you figure out he was lying sooner?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself constantly. How had I allowed myself to be manipulated for so long? How had I convinced myself that a secret relationship was blessed by God? I wanted to believe him. I told Michael honestly. I wanted to believe that God had finally given me the love and family I'd always wanted, and your father, David, was very good at making his lies sound like spiritual truth. The financial aftermath was complicated. On one hand, the court ordered restitution for the money David had stolen from the church. On the other hand, I was left in a precarious position because the financial support I'd depended on for 20 years was gone. The house we'd lived in belonged to the church, and with the church closing, we had to find somewhere else to live. My job at the grocery store wasn't enough to support 4 children on my own, and at 52 years old, I was essentially starting over from nothing. But something unexpected happened. The wider community, learning the full truth of what had happened to my family, rallied around us in ways I never could have anticipated. A local businessman donated the down payment for a small house. The elementary school where Rebecca attended started a fund to help with our living expenses. People I'd never met sent cards with money and messages of support. "You were brave to tell the truth," one letter read. "Your children are lucky to have a mother who fought for them." Linda Richardson's recovery became a bright spot in an otherwise dark situation. With proper medical care and the gradual removal of the psychiatric drugs David had been giving her, she began to emerge from the fog that had consumed her life for over 15 years. She moved to an assisted living facility near her sister in another state, and while she never fully recovered all of her cognitive abilities, she regained enough independence to make her own decisions and live with dignity. Before she moved away, she came to visit me one last time. "Maggie," she said, "I want you to know that I don't blame you for what David did. You were as much his victim as I was. Maybe more, because you had to carry the burden of raising children in his lies." We hugged goodbye, 2 women who had survived the same predator in different ways, and I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. As 2013 began, My family was finally free from David Richardson's control and manipulation. We were financially struggling, emotionally scarred, and still dealing with the aftermath of 20 years of deception. But we were free, and for the first time in 2 decades, I was making decisions based on my own judgment, my own values, and my own understanding of what was right for my children. The hardest part of our journey was still ahead, learning to heal, learning to trust again, learning to live authentically after years of living a lie. But we were finally living in the truth, and that made all the difference. It's been 10 years since David Richardson was sentenced to prison, and I'm sitting here at 62 years old, looking back on a journey that nearly destroyed me, but ultimately set me free. The woman I am today bears little resemblance to the vulnerable, manipulated person I was for so many years, and I want to share what I've learned about healing, forgiveness, and finding your own truth. The first few years after David's conviction were the hardest of my life. Not because I missed him, I was relieved to be free of his control, but because I had to confront the reality of who I had become during those 20 years of deception. I had to face the fact that I had allowed myself to be convinced that secret relationships were blessed by God, that my children's pain was somehow part of a divine plan, and that a man's reputation mattered more than my family's well-being. I had lost myself so completely in David's version of reality that I barely knew who I was without his guidance. The guilt was overwhelming. How could I have been so blind? How could I have subjected my children to a lifetime of lies? How could I have been complicit in Linda Richardson's abuse by believing David's stories about her willing participation in our arrangement? I fell into a deep depression in the months following the trial. There were days when I could barely get out of bed, let alone take care of my children who were dealing with their own trauma from our public exposure and their father's betrayal. It was Sarah, my eldest daughter, who finally convinced me to seek professional help. "Mom," she said one evening when she was home from college, "you were a victim of systematic psychological abuse. You need to stop blaming yourself and start healing from what was done to you." I started seeing a therapist who specialized in religious trauma and manipulation. Dr. Patricia Williams was a godsend. She helped me understand how predators like David use spiritual authority to control their victims, and she guided me through the long process of reclaiming my own judgment and self-worth. "Maggie," Dr. Williams told me during one of our early sessions, "what happened to you is more common than you might think." Religious leaders who abuse their position of trust often convince their victims that the abuse is divinely ordained. It's not a weakness on your part that you believed him. It's evidence of how skillfully he manipulated your faith. Through therapy, I began to understand that my vulnerability to David's manipulation had roots that went back long before I met him. My first marriage had been to a controlling man who had undermined my confidence and left me feeling worthless. When I found myself divorced and struggling as a single mother, I was the perfect target for someone who offered love, support, and spiritual certainty. Predators have an instinct for finding people who are isolated, vulnerable, and searching for meaning, Dr. Williams explained. David Richardson saw a woman who needed guidance and support, and he used those needs to serve his own purposes. But understanding how I had been victimized was only the first step. The harder work was learning to trust my own perceptions again, to make decisions based on my own values rather than someone else's interpretation of God's will. My children were on their own healing journeys, each processing the trauma of our shared deception in different ways. Sarah channeled her anger into her social work studies, eventually specializing in helping other survivors of religious abuse. She graduated summa cum laude and went on to get her master's degree in clinical social work. She's now a therapist herself, working with women who have experienced similar manipulation. I want to help other people recognize the warning signs that we missed for so long, she told me when she decided on her career path. I want to make sure other families don't have to go through what we went through. Michael struggled the most in the immediate aftermath of David's exposure. His anger at both David and me was enormous, and he acted out in dangerous ways throughout his junior and senior years of high school. He was arrested twice for underage drinking, got into fights, and barely graduated. But during his early 20s, something shifted. He joined the military, and the structure and purpose he found there seemed to give him a way to channel his anger constructively. He served 2 tours overseas and came back with a maturity and perspective that had been forged in difficult circumstances. I realized I could either let what happened define me, Or I could use it to become stronger, he told me when he returned from his second deployment. I chose to be stronger. Daniel, always the quietest of my children, processed his trauma through art. He became an incredible painter, creating works that explored themes of truth, deception, and identity. His senior art project in high school was a series of self-portraits showing the same face with different expressions. The many faces of living a lie, he called it. He's now in art school on a full scholarship, and his work has been featured in several exhibitions. He says that art saved his life by giving him a way to express feelings he couldn't put into words. Rebecca, my youngest, was 12 when our world exploded, and in many ways, her youth was both a blessing and a curse. She didn't fully understand the adult complexities of what had happened, but she felt the pain of her father's rejection deeply. She struggled with trust issues throughout her teenage years, finding it difficult to believe that adults would tell her the truth about anything important. But she found healing through music, learning to play guitar, and writing songs about her experiences. One of her songs, written when she was 16, brought me to tears the first time I heard it. You said you loved me. But you hid my name, you said you needed me. But you felt no shame in making me a secret, in making me a lie. Now I'm learning how to live with truth instead of asking why. Rebecca is now in college studying music therapy, hoping to help other children who have experienced trauma find healing through music the way she did. As for me, rebuilding my life at 52 years old was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in decades, I was making decisions based on my own judgment rather than someone else's interpretation of God's will. I went back to school, using financial aid and community scholarships to get a degree in counseling. It took me 6 years, attending classes part-time while working and raising my younger children, but I graduated at 58 with a bachelor's degree in psychology. I now work as a counselor at a women's crisis center, helping other survivors of domestic abuse and manipulation. My own experiences, as painful as they were, have given me insights that help me connect with women who are trapped in similar situations. I understand what it's like to lose yourself in someone else's version of reality, I tell the women I counsel. And I'm here to tell you that you can find your way back to yourself. It's hard work, but you're worth it. One of the most difficult parts of my healing journey was learning to have a relationship with faith again. David had used my religious beliefs as weapons against me for 20 years, convincing me that his manipulation was God's will. After his exposure, I was angry at God, angry at the church, and angry at myself for being so easily deceived. But gradually, with the help of a wonderful female pastor named Reverend Maria Santos, I began to separate my faith from the abuse I had experienced. God didn't do this to you, Maggie, Reverend Santos told me. A man who claimed to speak for God did this to you. There's a big difference. I found a new church, a small, progressive congregation where women are valued as equals, where transparency is prioritized over reputation, and where questions are encouraged rather than discouraged. It took me years to feel comfortable sitting in a pew again, but eventually, I rediscovered the peace and community that healthy faith can provide. My relationship with my children has deepened and strengthened as we've all healed from our shared trauma. We talk openly now about what happened to us, and we support each other through the ongoing process of recovery. Family dinners are different now than they were during the years of secrets. There's an honesty, an authenticity, that we never had before. We talk about real things, our struggles, our victories, our fears, our dreams. We don't have to pretend anymore. And that freedom has brought us closer together than we ever were when we were hiding the truth. Sarah is married now to a wonderful man named James who treats her with the respect and honesty she deserves. They have 2 beautiful daughters, and Sarah is determined to raise them with complete transparency about their family's history. I want my daughters to know that they should never accept being someone's secret, she told me. I want them to understand their worth from the beginning, so no one can convince them to accept less than they deserve. Michael met his wife Jennifer during his military service, and they have a son together. Michael is studying to become a teacher, wanting to work with at-risk youth who might be vulnerable to manipulation. Daniel's art continues to heal not just himself but others who see his work. He had an exhibition last year called Breaking the Silence that dealt with themes of family secrets and recovery. Several survivors of religious abuse contacted him after seeing the show, saying his work helped them feel less alone. Rebecca is thriving in college, and has started a support group for other young adults who grew up in deceptive family situations. She's become an advocate for truth and transparency in family relationships. As for Linda Richardson, she has found her own peace. Her sister tells me that Linda has regained much of her cognitive function and lives independently in a senior community near her family. She has no memory of most of the years when David was medicating her, which might be a blessing. She sent me a card on the 5th anniversary of David's conviction. It simply said, "Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth. We're both free now." David himself was released on parole last year after serving 8 years of his 12-year sentence. I heard from a friend that he moved to another state and is living quietly, supposedly working in construction. Part of his parole agreement prohibits him from serving in any leadership capacity in religious organizations. I have no desire to see him or communicate with him. He took 20 years of my life and caused immeasurable damage to our children. I've forgiven him in the sense that I no longer carry anger toward him. Holding on to that anger was only hurting me. But forgiveness doesn't mean I want him in our lives. My children have different relationships with forgiveness. Sarah has reached a place of acceptance without reconciliation. Michael still struggles with anger, but is working through it in therapy. Daniel has found peace through his art. Rebecca has decided that David lost the right to be called their father when he denied their existence, and she's at peace with that decision. We all respect each other's different approaches to processing what happened to us. 10 years later, I can honestly say that exposing David Richardson was the best decision I ever made. Despite the pain it caused in the short term, living in truth, even difficult truth, is infinitely better than living in a lie, no matter how comfortable that lie might seem. I want other women who might be listening to my story to understand something important. If you're in a relationship that requires you to hide, to lie, to deny your own perceptions of reality, to accept being someone's secret, that relationship is not blessed by God or anyone else. You deserve to be loved openly, honestly, and completely. If someone is using spiritual authority to convince you to accept treatment that feels wrong, trust your instincts. God doesn't ask us to hide our relationships or deny our children. God doesn't ask us to sacrifice our dignity for someone else's reputation. And if you're in a situation like I was, isolated, dependent, afraid to leave because you don't know how you'll survive, there are people who will help you. There are resources available. There are other survivors who understand what you're going through. It won't be easy. Leaving a manipulative relationship, especially one that's been disguised as spiritual guidance, is one of the hardest things you can do. But you are stronger than you know, and you deserve a life lived in truth. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I am not ashamed of my story anymore. I was manipulated and deceived by a man who used his position of spiritual authority to exploit my faith and vulnerability. But I survived, my children survived, and we are living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your truth. If my story helps even one woman recognize the warning signs of spiritual abuse and find the courage to seek help, then everything we went through will have had purpose. We are not the secrets someone else made us keep. We are not the lies someone else told about us. We are not defined by the manipulation we survived. We are survivors, we are truth tellers, and we are free.